Most of Donald Trump's trade tariffs are on a pause, except on China. So the Chinese president is on the move, talking to trade partners in Asia.
Standing at a new historical starting point, China is willing to strengthen strategic communication, solidarity and coordination with Vietnam.
I see the meeting today. Is that wonderful? It's a lovely meeting.
This visit is, again, a historic visit. It is strategic and a boost for the bilateral relations of the two countries.
The meeting, like trying to figure out how do we screw the United States of America?
China does not want to fight, but is not afraid to fight.
Fighting talk, but do these tariffs hurt China nonetheless? And what about the rest of Asia? Does China see an opportunity to expand its influence there? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Pirish Banerjee.
And I'm Pablo Folilias, and I'll be looking at your comments and questions in the chat and bringing them into the discussion. So please do send them in to us. And people have already been commenting, and we've got a few that I'm going to read out to you now. One from C.H. Michael, who says, China should remember how they were capable of transforming their country so quickly. Better to open up their market than to cut their exports even more. Open trade is good for both sides. Then there's another comment here from Dua Listol 9122. There's no consumer like the American. They should just apologise and get the tariff reduced other than travelling from one country to the other, referring, of course, to Xi Jinping, who's been travelling outside of China, of course. And then I'll put one more in, which is, it's so long here. It's L3 Eid Alpha. It keeps going on. Anyone worried about the geopolitical shifts are really worried that the Chinese will be as bad as the Americans if they become the eminent power. If you're not American, this is much less of a worry, as the Chinese appear much less expansionist. Where is the signs of US hard power globally? Everywhere, they say. So, yeah, some great comments. Please do send them in, and we will be reading them out throughout the show.
Thanks so much, Pablo. And as part of this stream, the whole stream is basically a discussion, and the discussion we'll be having with at least three experts, one of whom is already in the studio with us, and it happens to be Clifford Coonan from DW Business. Clifford, of course, lived in China and reported from there for a number of years, and you've seen the growth in Chinese trade policy and also Chinese trade, not just with the United States, but also within Asia. So something that we'll be discussing. Welcome, Clifford. To Clifford's right, of course, Jared Reid, an seasoned I was going to say old DW hand, but no, seasoned DW News Desk hand, going to be providing us some context on where we are with this this constantly moving tariff story. Someone you will not be seeing, but is someone who's making this stream possible is, of course, producer Paul Hurst, who's sitting with our magnificent technical crew making this stream possible. Also at the table, Nehal Johri, who is going to be in the chat talking to you guys and bringing some of the comments to Pablo and myself. But that's not the only thing you'll be doing, because you also have
we have a poll question.
We have a poll question.
Always a new question. And the question for today is, how will Trump's tariffs reshape Asia's future? And you have four options. You can vote for boost. The first is boost intra-Asia trade. 2, expand China's influence. 3, push out US as leading partner. And 4, forge new non-Asian alliances. And you can vote for that just at the top of your live chat.
And we will have the poll results towards the end of the stream. And who knows when the end of the stream is going to be.
It's always a surprise.
We've talked about tariffs for so long.
Yep.
And for so many weeks. I think we might be talking about tariffs next week as well, but then we'll come to next week later.
There'll be new tariffs next week that we can talk about, probably.
What are tariffs? But let's just dive into this stream on tariffs, because this is where Jared Reid comes in, and we really need a catch-up on where we are with the tariffs, because it just, at one point, they seem permanent, and then they are walked back. And then there is something else that opens up, another back door or something. So where are we? What's going on, Jared?
And who knows what might change between now and tomorrow,
While
right?
you're talking right now.
While I'm talking as we speak. Let's go back to where it kind of all began, if we can say that. That's a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Liberation Day. And that's something we discussed here on News Desk. You can go back a couple of weeks and see what we had to say and what we kind of predicted, or what we had to say back then, what our analysts thought would happen. that's when Donald Trump essentially unveiled this huge list, and I've got that picture here, if we can bring that up to show you a big list of countries that were going to be the targets of what Donald Trump described as reciprocal tariffs. These are tariffs on many of the US's trading partners around the world. Now, these tariffs that you can see ended up being put on hold, a pause for 90 days, excluding a baseline 10% tariff for all countries, critically though not on China. So the White House first announced tariffs on Beijing of 125% and then increased that to a pretty eye-watering 145%. Beijing retaliated by increasing its tariffs on US imports to 125% as well. Now, you're talking sort of about walkbacks here. The Trump administration has announced a reprieve for certain tech products like laptops and smartphones, but that's only temporary as well until the US develops, I guess, new sector-specific levies on semiconductor imports. And semiconductors are these tiny chips that power things like laptops and mobile phones, and they're critical because they essentially allow and enable global connectivity. Tariffs on these are on their way, according to certain US officials, and we're going to hear from one. His name is Howard Lutnick, the US Secretary of Commerce. Let's hear what he had to say.
Our medicines and our semiconductors need to be built in America. Donald Trump is on it. He's calling that out. So you should understand these are included in the semiconductor tariffs that are coming and the pharmaceuticals are coming. Those two areas are coming in the next month or two. So this is not like a permanent sort of exemption. He's just clarifying that these are not available to be negotiated away by countries. These are things that are national security that we need to be made in America.
That was Howard Lutnick there, the US Secretary of Commerce. And this is all happening, interestingly, as the Chinese leader Xi visits Southeast Asia this week. And earlier this week, I was interviewing our dear news desk colleague, Melissa Chan, who is on, it's a temporary posting to our studios in Taipei. So she's working there as a correspondent, and I was asking her about this particular trip. And I can kind of tell you what she told me. She was saying that this trip to Southeast Asia is interesting because she isn't asking countries to come to him, he's going to them. He's reaching out to them. He's visiting Malaysia, Vietnam and Cambodia. Vietnam and Cambodia in particular were hard hit by these tariffs before they were put on hold. So 46% for Vietnam, 24% for Malaysia before they were suspended. So it is kind of an advantageous trip for Xi to be taking right now, to be seen to be coming across as a stable leader, communicating with the region and indicating that he's open to trade with his neighbours. And we can kind of see that through some of the more positive statements that have come out of the trip so far. So China and Vietnam have signed a number of agreements, about 45, including deals on enhancing supply chains, cooperating on railways, and they voiced their support for what they described as a multilateral trade regime centred around the World Trade Organization. Now, Xi is in Malaysia, where he is expected to discuss the possibility of a free trade agreement between China and the ASEAN nations. And for a reminder at home, this is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is actually China's top trade partner. And I can show a graph from 2023 of that, where ASEAN is up the top. And just to remind you, ASEAN, the members of ASEAN are Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, Myanmar, Malaysia, Laos, Indonesia, Cambodia and Brunei. So if a free trade agreement ended up happening between China and this bloc, that would be a very big deal. Xi has also kind of voiced he's promised Malaysia and Vietnam access to the Chinese markets, greater access to the Chinese markets, and I guess we can really see him trying to consolidate these economic and trade ties with China's neighbours amid this much wider and serious standoff with the United States.
I'm going to jump in actually with a couple of comments that we've got coming in, because there's one which is Well, we'll call it, maybe this person is a touch of a comedian. It's DNA 1238. They're saying there's two completely different business approaches here. One travels to other countries to do a deal, referring to, of course, Xi Jinping. The other plays golf, watches UFC, and waits for countries to call him for a deal. Then there's, of course, a book, The Art of the Deal, which is Donald Trump's, I think, one of his autobiographies. Then we have got some of our regular viewers, so big shout out to them. First, DeVos, who says, I'll go with the expansion of Chinese influence. And then to another comment here from Carolina Vilena, good thing the tariffs on technology has paused for 90 days as well. In that case, time to purchase a lot of gadgets before it resumes. So, yeah, we're getting those comments coming in, so please do keep them in the chat there for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a chat that basically keeps this discussion going. And as you send in more comments, I have a few questions. And this is where I'd like to bring you in, Cliff. But based on what Jared was talking about there and what Xi Jinping was saying in Vietnam, essentially in the press release that came out, there was this phrasing of we will uphold multilateralism. You see this increasingly with China and all the statements that are coming out, not just from Xi Jinping during his trip, but also the Commerce Ministry. The constant use of the word multilateralism, China trying to position itself as this multilateral player. Is that something that is music to the ASEAN countries' ears? Is that something that does anything to assuage the fears that they might have about the impact of tariffs on their economy?
I think what we're seeing here is it looks like an economic story, but actually it's a political story. This is the deals that we've seen in Vietnam and that we will see in Malaysia. There's one or two concrete measures, but most of them are basically political measures, sealing friendship, this sort of language, particularly with Vietnam because it's also a communist country, so you have that sort of rhetoric. And a lot of talk about free trade. But China isn't actually technically interested in free trade. Right. It's always operated a very protectionist, mercantilist approach. The mercantilism being that school of economics, which is kind of nationalistic, where you import a little, you export a lot. And Chinese exports are running 4 times faster than the global average. So it's an exporting nation. And this is an opportunity for it to export a lot more goods. So while the rhetoric in Southeast Asia is going to be very much about community and trying to ease these fears, these countries also know that China has a big interest in exporting and using it as a market for the goods that it has. And at the same time, there's always the political backdrop to that, which is, of course, Chinese expansionism. They have territorial disputes with all of the countries in ASEAN. So it's a very much a mixed message. But I think, while the headline figure is very much taking on the US and all these different countries coming together against the US, I think there's an awful lot of divisions there that are going behind the headlines.
And we will pass through a number of things that you've talked about, territorial disputes with ASEAN neighbours, other thing like territorial disputes with 4 of the 10 ASEAN members, and there's also this thing of Chinese overcapacity. But just back to the 145% tariff that exists on China at the moment. I mean, it is irrelevant, right, whether it's 145% or 245%, because after a certain level, trade just does not make any sense anymore, right? I mean, is it fair to say that trade between the United States and China has effectively stopped?
Yeah. This is basically an embargo. This is the end of trade. We just had figures today, economic data, which showed that the Chinese economy grew very strongly in the first quarter of the year. But nobody expects that to happen in the second quarter. Mm-hmm. It's going to see severe pressure because so much of its exports are going to the US. And to other countries, but even other countries are not going to be able to pick up the slack from China. So the economy is going to come under an awful lot of pressure going forward. But interestingly, I was talking to a friend today who has a factory in Shenzhen. He has a company in Shenzhen with several factories. Now, a lot of his goods are exempted under these new tariffs because they're tech products. But he was saying that in China at the moment, he said it's like a war. It's being characterized as a war. People are cheering when there's various wins for China, what's seen as a win for China. For example, today they said that they were not going to take any Boeing planes. Yeah. This has been hugely welcomed, and the fact that Nvidia, which is going to be subject to tariffs, that was also seen as a win because it will boost domestic chip producers. And because the message is so tightly controlled in China, it can be done as a kind of a struggle. Everything is about struggle, campaign, strong
the heroic
China.
victory of the Chinese people, which J.D. Vance might see as Chinese peasants. But of course, that's not how China sees it. Clifford, stay with us because I'd like to bring in one of the other experts who'll be part of this discussion. Trisha Yeo is joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Trisha, can you see us? Trisha is with the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham in Malaysia. Trisha, thanks so much for making the time. We know it is late evening where you are, so kudos to you for making the time. We are very pleased that you could make it. Let me just start with what is happening in Malaysia. Xi Jinping in the same city as you are, talking to Malaysian leaders. What is the message that he has brought to Malaysia, and is that the message that Malaysia wants to hear?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's quite a monumental and historic time. Yesterday, as I was driving back, I could see these huge red signboards all across the city welcoming the President of China, Xi Jinping, into the city. Tonight, as I speak, there is a state dinner that's being hosted for him. So, the first time in over a decade for Xi Jinping to visit Malaysia. It's definitely got a sort of celebratory feel almost in the city. The message that's being sent, of course, is that China is here as a reliable, stable trading partner, quite unlike what we've been seeing coming out from the Washington, D.C. flip-flopping of policies. And we are here to stay. We've had a long historic relationship. We are celebrating 50 years of relationship with Malaysia. And President Xi has already said, we're looking forward to another golden 50 years to come. I've also seen the transcripts of the speech of our Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, in welcoming President Xi. And it's all very, I think one of you mentioned earlier, the language that's used is kind of very warm and fuzzy, welcoming more bilateral relationship. I can talk a little bit more about that if you want, but that's the feel that we're getting and the sense we're getting. And of course, it's coming on the back of what's been happening in Washington, D.C. with the reciprocal tariffs being announced.
Okay, let's take this opportunity to bring in another expert who's also been looking at the tariffs and what they mean for Asia. We're talking about Ben Bland. He's director of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. Ben, thank you for making the time. I hope you can see us and you're being able to hear what Trisha is saying. I was looking at your X tweets. Does one call them tweets anymore? I don't know, X postings. And you had this long thread and you said something along the lines of, there is nothing remarkable about this visit. It is just a, quote, typical example of China's neighborhood diplomacy, unquote. Is this really just a normal visit, even though it's happening in the backdrop of these tariffs from D.C.?
Look, as Trisha said, Xi Jinping himself hasn't been to Malaysia for a while. But what we know is that the high-level contacts between China and its neighbors in Beijing, on the sidelines of regional and global forums, have been happening on many, many occasions in the last few years. The timing of US policy to China and to Asia and to global trade obviously gives a different accent to these visits. But in a way, as I said, what's remarkable for me is that there is nothing remarkable about this, that China and its neighbors in Southeast Asia have normal, deep, high-level relationships with a lot of areas for cooperation, and also, which obviously isn't mentioned on these visits, a lot of tensions, a lot of geopolitical tensions, territorial disputes, questions about fears of Chinese business concentration and competition, and a fear that markets will be flooded with Chinese goods as Chinese companies are squeezed out of the US market. So I think this is normal diplomacy, but the rest of the world is much more interested in it because of what's happening in the US.
Hi, Ben. I'm Trisha. I'm Pablo. I'm the co-host today. I just have a comment because I'm keeping an eye on what our viewers are saying, which I thought was quite interesting. It's from Carolina Vilena again, who's a very keen viewer of ours who lives in the Philippines. And she says, we don't want to be either too pro-US nor pro-China because it could hurt our economy and we may no longer survive. So how are countries essentially in the region dealing with that, or are they dealing with that, or are they just sort of saying, or some countries are, could you explain a little bit more about that topic of trying to not be too friendly with one or the other?
Yeah, maybe if I can just build on what Ben was just saying. It's really interesting because it's not as if these disputes just go away overnight, right? So the ongoing disputes around South China Sea and the fears, I suppose, of overcapacity of Chinese goods coming to flood the markets, and not forgetting that Vietnam and Malaysia also have excess of capacity now, given the tariffs, and our export market is also in the US. So I think how I respond to that is that there is going to be a huge differential between what you see the countries saying publicly. And this is something that is very culturally aligned with the Asians, right? So it's a lot about, how much skin you save, like how much face you save. So the public statements, the speeches, the dinners, the fanfare, all of that will be all about aligning with China. But in the meantime, we need to be able to read between the lines and see what are the concrete announcements that are being made. So obviously, and Malaysia already has had a history of this, maintain diplomatic relations with China, while at the same time continuing to pursue deep investment trading relationships with the US. I mean, by the way, right, like we talk about security, the US also continues to have military joint exercises with Malaysia. In fact, it has a longer history of having military joint exercises with Malaysia than Malaysia has had with China, which was introduced relatively later.
But Trisha, aren't we're in a domain of reliability, right? Or rather unreliability. We do not know what happens tomorrow. We do not know while this stream is on if something new is announced from DC and if there is suddenly a change of policy. This is certainly a new domain that we are in, aren't we?
It's a totally new domain, and which is why at this point at least, the policymakers are actually having to make a strategic choice between doing something for the short term, like over the next 4 years, versus thinking about it for the longer term, which is, post Trump's administration. And even then, I mean, we also know that he's trying to do measures to maintain his stay in power. So I think one of the things that I just wrote was that would the short-term measures eventually become longer term just because of the ways, you need to make decisions around supply chains, around like manufacturing factories and so on. I mean, these things take time, right? So there's a time lag factor as well that we need to take into consideration.
Ben,
just to jump in there. I mean, on this question, I mean, transactionalism isn't something new for most Asian leaders and Asian governments, right? I mean, in many senses, American voters and the White House is late to the party. India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, China, the leaders of all these countries have dealt purely in transactional terms. They don't have allies and alliances. They don't talk seriously about values. They're really all about the transactional foreign policy. So in some ways, you would think Southeast Asia would be well set up for this world. But I think here's where the problem comes in, right? What's happening now is that not just the US, but China are going to be squeezing countries and asking them to align, not once and for all, not to become an ally, but they're going to be asking them to align on lots of different issues. Who do you trade with? Who do you buy your technology from? Who provides your internet cables? And I think in this world of contestation, both China and the US, and even after Trump, are going to be imposing higher costs on countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, where they do and don't align. So I think that's the challenge. In a sense, countries are used to dealing with transactionalism, but I think what we're going to see is a lot of sticks as well as the carrots. And I think that's going to be the deeply uncomfortable point. And Southeast Asian countries are just going to try and stay as plugged in to the US and China as they can for as long as possible. But I don't think, as your listener suggested, sort of maintaining equidistance, that doesn't make any sense. It's going to be about thinking what's in each country's national interests. And that will be different issues where it makes sense to work with China and different issues where it makes more sense to work with the US. But the key question is, how high the costs that Beijing and Washington are going to impose on these countries be? And I think that they're going to get higher and higher.
And I do want to talk about individual responses potentially within the ASEAN group and also ASEAN as a whole, but I want to do that a little later. We were just talking before the stream began as to what is it that China is making and what is the offer that China is making to ASEAN nations. And what do you think that offer is, Ben, if one reads between the lines, as Trisha is asking us to do? What is the offer here that China is making, saying that we export more to us, we will buy more of your products, as the commitment came out in Malaysia that we will buy more Malaysian agricultural products? Or is the idea that, look, you need to be a market for our overcapacity? Is that what China is saying?
Look, I like to see things in a longer term horizon. And I think we have to take a step back here and think about the broader Chinese offer, reading between the lines, as Trisha put it, not what's in the statements. So the Communist Party of China likes to talk about things like win-win cooperation and building a community of shared destiny for mankind. But really what the offer to Southeast Asia is this. It's Chinese primacy or hegemony in the region, acknowledging China as the primary power in Asia, the leader of the region's geopolitical architecture, the leader of the region's technology and economic standards, and the dominant power when it comes to the South China Sea. And in return for sort of acknowledging China's primacy and dialing down relations with the US, what countries will get is access to cheap Chinese technology, whether that's 5G or EVs or electrical batteries or other kinds of renewable energy, whether it's e-commerce. So becoming part of this sort of Asia for the Asians economic integrated bloc. I mean, that's not what's in the statement, but that's the vision, I think, that the Communist Party, that Xi Jinping has for China's neighborhood relations, neighborhood diplomacy. I think that's attractive to some countries in the region at some points, less attractive to others. And even within a country like Malaysia or Indonesia, there'll be very sort of disparate views within society, politics, and the business community about that. But, none of that is coming out of the joint statements. It's all nice words. But I think we have to think critically here about what's actually going on in the medium to long term.
I'm really glad that you've said this very frankly, Chinese primacy, even in the long term. And this is where I want to come to you, Clifford. As somebody who's reported from China, this is literally the Chinese dream coming true, right? I mean, we don't know if it'll come true or not, but it is the dream that is taking the first few steps into potential action, right?
Yeah, it's the whole notion of everything under heaven. It's the old imperial
Middle Kingdom,
the Middle Kingdom, the imperial model again, and vassal states on the periphery. There's certainly elements of that, and it must be. That offer, for example, as Ben was saying, if you're a Malaysian car manufacturer, you don't necessarily want BYD coming in and flooding the market, right? So there's all kinds of areas where there's overlap now. Vietnam, especially, where Vietnam has so much overlap now with production in China that it's a competitor in regional terms. All of these things are, these haven't gone away just because Donald Trump has introduced these tariffs. These are only going to exacerbate now. So this is very much a political move, I think, and everyone in the region has their own complex reasons, mostly transactional. But there's also, I know that, like in Malaysia, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of opposition to the US about its stance in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then
Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has been very outspoken when it comes to that conflict. Yeah,
and he's very angry with the US on that. Which is a lot of people were saying in the run-up to this, that this is one of the things driving part of the reason why it's so warmly welcomed. And everyone else in the region has got their own various beefs. Indonesia, the Philippines, and as you say, we're going to get into this probably in a bit. But I think in terms of trade, there's just too much. There are too many areas where they will not be able to find agreement, particularly with dumping, because all of this was happening before the tariffs, and these were issues before the tariffs. There were issues here in Europe with China before the tariffs.
But at least you had the US market as
an outlet. Now there's this sort of attempt almost to build a coalition, but the backdrop to this is about China asserting this primacy that has come over the last few years, with the last 4 decades, with it building the economy, where it's now trying to that economic muscle with political strength and diplomatic strength.
Jump in there because we have some great comments coming in. There's one here from Andy CB who says the US will want to see to be seen to be winning in this tariff war. China will play the long game. China will expand its influence as trade elsewhere. Uncertainty will pause projects in the United States. That's from one of our viewers. And then what you were saying there before, the Global South fears a dash of cheap imports from which they can further destroy domestic industries, but also undermine strategic sectors and make them dependent on China. So there's just a couple of comments. That was from Nile Chaturvedi, who's following the chat.
Some regular people who post in the chat. I'm really glad that you're posting on that. Trisha, if I can come to you on this whole point of cheap imports and something that Ben was also talking about flooding Asian economies with Chinese goods. We keep hearing of this existing ASEAN-China free trade area, for example. And then you also have the RCEP, regional... economic partnership.
Regional and comprehensive economic partnership.
That's the one. There you go. Thank you. RCEP. You have these two, trade deals, so to speak, that are already existing. One of them is specific to ASEAN. Is this an opportunity for China to use this to dump more products on Southeast Asian countries, or is there an opportunity there for ASEAN nations as well to send something along China's way?
So I think this is really a time for ASEAN to think deeply about what it wants to do. So prior to this, ASEAN has really not been something as united or institutionalized as the EU as we know.
Right, yeah.
And ASEAN has, I think this is the test for ASEAN. Is it going to come together to make policies together for the sake of, some kind of comprehensive collective strategic gain, or is it going to continue as it always has, to be honest, individual countries thinking about their own strategic wins? And already you can see that happening, right? Because when Anwar Ibrahim, as the chair of ASEAN, Malaysia being the chair of ASEAN, tried to say, okay, no, we're all going to negotiate together, but no, like Vietnam goes off on its own to send emissaries already to Washington, D.C. But we know why, because Vietnam was a really high hit, 46%. So that's a test for ASEAN. What is it going to do? And like ASEAN versus China as well. So yes, there's a lot of talk about cooperation, upgrading of the free trade, trade in goods agreement and so on. But both China and ASEAN, I think at the surface you would think is common interest just because of the US pulling out from WTO type agreements. But that's not necessarily the case that there actually will be some kind of regional benefits. So each country could actually be looking out for themselves as well, as we mentioned earlier. But I wanted to also jump in on something else, which has been talked about, this idea of the cheap imports, right? Flooding and destroying the local sectors. So I think we've seen some of that happening in Indonesia already, like some protests from local companies having to shut down, unemployment potentially on the rise already. Some of the research that previously the institute that I was head of did looked at not just cheaper imports, but the technology that's being imported into our countries. And the one that we looked at specifically was the steel industry. And that was interesting because the largest steel producers in Malaysia were starting to become the ones from China. And the technology that they use also happened to be the technology that was the most carbon emitting. And the local steel manufacturers in Malaysia were actually unhappy with the rise of the Chinese technology, and they wanted to, in a way, like say, let's be taxed as an industry because we're not the ones that are actually causing the carbon problems and the carbon emissions. So you can see from the chart that our emissions have gone up exponentially, and that's not because of the local steel manufacturers. So that's really an interesting case study. It's not just about the goods themselves, but it's also about the types of technologies that are being, exported out of China, which sometimes the local manufacturers are unwilling to stay. And the last thing I'll say just at this point is going back to this, the positioning, so the cultural positioning. So even prior to this, I think it was mentioned by one of you, the position that Anwar and the Muslim world has taken with regards to Gaza and Palestine, that has already it sent a lot of consternation already amongst many Asian countries. And I think culturally, a lot of Southeast Asian countries feel caught. So they feel conflicted internally. On the one hand, they are deeply unhappy and dissatisfied with the way foreign relations and diplomacy has been conducted. They see the US as taking a position, a very hegemonic position for the longest time. And now many of them would feel secretly that, okay, this is the time that Asia can fight back. While at the same time, knowing that you can't completely cut out the Western world because of these deep economic and trade ties that have been developed over time. So I would say there's a lot of conflict. You will see leaders making, statements that are seemingly disparate because they really are. I think this is where all the values are being tested, right? Economic and political.
And it'd be interesting to see how Washington, D.C. responds to all of this. We've been talking a lot about what might happen in Southeast Asia and ASEAN economies. I'd like to talk a bit more about that, but not to lose sight of what is happening within China as well. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, Clifford, because today, Q1 data came out for China, performing at about 5.4%, better than expected. Again, this is before the tariffs. Anybody's guess what will happen to it after the tariffs. But then I'd like to play a soundbite. This is from Sheng Layun. He's the Deputy Director of the National Bureau of Statistics. It's very interesting what he said today, I think that was. Let's listen to that soundbite. And I'd like to come to you, Ben, after that for some analysis on that.
However, we should be aware that the external environment is becoming more complex and severe. The drive for the growth of effective domestic demand is insufficient, and the foundation for sustained economic recovery and growth is yet to be consolidated.
Right. So, a rare admission. I've not seen this kind of an admission from a state official talking about China's economic performance, talking about the challenges that are expected. China itself, Ben, is facing headwinds, right? They were facing headwinds before these tariffs, and now the headwinds, and now the tariffs add further headwinds to it, right?
Yeah, it's been a difficult economic outlook from China. The economy's never really fully bounced back and found its animal spirits post the long and deep shutdown during COVID in China. Added to that, there are these long-term problems of the aging population, the shrinking workforce, the build-up of debts in the property sector and the local government sector as well. So there have been these long-standing questions. And then you have this trade war and technology war with the US layered on top of it. So I think it's a really difficult outlook. And what you can see is that the Chinese leadership are preparing their people and their companies for a long and difficult fight ahead. And I think, the language, not just there, but in general from the top leadership in China and Xi Jinping himself, has been about, maybe needing to put national security first above short-term economic growth. And I think that signals, that they believe this is going to be a long battle with the US that's going to be continuing even after Donald Trump has left office, maybe after his third or fourth terms, if he manages to change the US Constitution. So they're trying to settle their people in for a really long competition. And basically what you have is a game of chicken between the US and China, saying, who's going to back down first? I mean, President Trump says it himself, when are they going to call me to seek a deal? But I think the messaging from China to their own people and to the rest of the world is, we're not going to rush in to make concessions to the United States here. And maybe, just maybe, we're going to have to make do with lower growth and an even tougher economy to defend our national security. The last thing I'll say is it's easy to say that now, right? When your companies start going bankrupt, when millions and millions of people start losing their jobs, it gets much harder to sustain that position. And I think the same would be true in the US if we start to see the economic impact of these tariffs hit home. So we're kind of still in the phony war era. Once the costs start to bite on companies and consumers in the US and China, we will see how much this competition means to the political leadership and the peoples on both sides. But sadly, for the rest of us, it doesn't bode well for our economic outlook in the meantime. And many of us, both in Europe and Southeast Asia, feel that we have very little agency. But the question is how much, as Tricia put it, can we all cooperate, not just within Southeast Asia or within Europe, but why not Southeast Asia and Europe and Japan and Korea and Australia? and countries that really believe in a predictable open trading system. Why can't we do more together? I mean, we should try. It's going to be hard to coordinate all that.
And those are questions I would like to go into. But just as a small sort of waypoint, just to look at what the chat is doing. Nehal has been monitoring the chat, just to give us an idea of what the mood there is. What is the mood there?
It is very, very active. So people are commenting a lot and they're arguing amongst themselves, which I'd say is great. You know, this is why we're here, to spark conversations. Just remember to be respectful. I mean, maybe don't call each other out on specific things, but a lot of people are talking about this sort of contradiction between, you know, somebody wrote, people love cheap stuff and people do want to buy cheap things. But then the manufacturing process also involves labor exploitation. And so there's this like conflicted feeling in the chat of like, how do you solve that? Or how do you, deal with tariffs in that process? And a lot of our viewers seem to be from Asia. They're pointing out that their own countries have had bad experiences with China. So there's this sort of caution in the air, even if China wants to trade more with them. But otherwise, lots of comments coming in. About 250 people have voted on the poll. So keep voting and keep your comments coming.
The poll remains open. It's interesting to see what options you choose. If I can, I'd like to sort of direct the discussion more towards ASEAN even more, and looking at the question of, intra-ASEAN unity, something that you were talking about. Trisha, what one can expect? Is there any way of building that? But before we do that, just for the benefit of everybody in the community, I'd like to play a soundbite from the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim. He said he was speaking on the 10th of April about ASEAN's position. This is something that has already come up in the discussion, but I'd just like to play this soundbite as a starting point in this part of the discussion.
We continue to have good bilateral and an excellent trading investment relationship with the United States. At the same time, our position in ASEAN is to ensure that our relations, particularly with China, other than Japan, Korea, and the neighboring countries, remain strong and formidable.
I mean, Trisha, just hearing that, it sounds like a number of things that we've heard from ASEAN, not just on economic issues, but also on political issues. This whole centrality of ASEAN in a neutral position. I want to be friends with everybody and friends with no one in particular. You were making the point earlier that this is going to be hard to do in this changing environment. What exactly will we see ASEAN doing in the next few months? Is this the moment, as you were calling a test of ASEAN, is this the moment that ASEAN passes this test and we actually see some kind of unity along the lines that we see in the European Union, for example, on trade?
I mean, it wasn't a very long time ago that there was actually a lot of frustration expressed as many Southeast Asian nations started to take up affiliation with BRICS. So Indonesia is part of BRICS, Malaysia is part of BRICS Plus, which is the sort of friendly partnership. And it also has applied to be part of the full BRICS itself. And when that happened, last year, a lot of commentary was stating that Malaysia is reaching too far. It's tilting too far too quickly to Russia and China. And now you fast forward to today, no one really, at least I'm talking about within Southeast Asia itself, people are actually feeling like, okay, let's go along with this BRICS idea because of the behavior that we're seeing from the US. So it sort of feels sometimes like the winds shift very quickly. Last year, the ICS, Yusof Ishak Institute from Singapore, so they do this Southeast Asia state survey of the Southeast Asian nations every year. And last year, when asked respondents within Southeast Asia, when forced to choose a side between US and China, if they were forced to, they said that they would pick China. This year, the survey has just come out earlier in April, and this year it's swiftly changed to the US. So in a way, I think this tells you that the allegiances are not necessarily clear, and it shifts along with what's actually happening geopolitically around the world. And one thing I wanted to say while reflecting on some of your comments was that if ASEAN, and of course in this case Malaysia, just because that's where I am. If we are serious about wanting to use this moment to gain something from China, in light of what's happening with the US, because we know we can't really depend on this erratic policymaker, then it's also a great moment to also put pressure on China to commit more to multilateral rules-based order, right? So what that means is, for example, China has made a bid to apply for the CPTPP, and while countries like Australia have come out to say that this is not going to be possible because it's a very high standards agreement, China won't be able to meet it because of certain things like the state-owned enterprises and so on, kind of ask China to put their money where their mouth is and really start to make deep improvements within their own governance structure. I mean, you kind of like take it as an opportunity. And then just on the back of what Ben said as well, in terms of bringing in the EU has also been caught by surprise, right? Like they were left out of certain negotiations in the Middle East for the first time. So they're also caught feeling like they don't have an ally in the US anymore. So this is also the perfect time for ASEAN and the EU to work more closely together. Again, speaking on the Malaysian side, Malaysia and the EU have just started resuming talks over the free trade agreement that has been stalled for over 10 years. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in there because we're obviously getting, as Nehal said, a lot of comments, a lot of conversation about ASEAN nations. One here from Carolina who says not all ASEANs are against China. And then we have another comment who says not all ASEANs are against China, but they should be since China wants to steal their maritime territory. So maybe we could actually expand a little bit on that, because that comment has come up a couple of times now in the chat.
And that word expansion is key to when you're talking about territory, pun intended. Do you want to come in on this, Clifford? I mean, this has really been a very touchy issue in ASEAN, particularly most ASEAN nations have China as one of their top trading partners, but they also have territorial disputes. Do they acquire a new focus, a new dynamic in the backdrop of the trade war?
I think this is a very difficult environment to be in for a lot of ASEAN countries, and I think as has been mentioned a couple of times, you've got to, if you take like the Philippines, for example, has got massive territorial disputes. It's got a huge with China, and it's got US bases. It's got, it's trying to juggle that. It needs trade with China, but we've seen a hardening of relations with China over, and it's ebbed and flowed. Because these are transactional. Although in the Philippines you could argue that there's a lot more on the value side as well that they like to align with the US. But generally, it's everyone. I think I get the feeling that everyone is struggling. I mean, we are in a situation of chaos at the moment, given that everything has been thrown up in the air. So, and that's why, as people have been saying, that we need to take if we try to take a longer term view of this and where we're going to be in a year's time, which again, you can't really predict. But in terms of alliances, they're not big on alliances. It's not about making friends. I mean, China doesn't have any friends. It doesn't have any allies as such. It has partners for trading purposes, but it's very.
I wanted to bring you in on this, Ben. I mean, Trisha, you were speaking a while back about maybe ASEAN getting together and making the point to China to loosen its structures a bit so that it works for ASEAN as well. Is that something, Ben, that could be applied when it comes to territorial disputes in which ASEAN gets together and say, okay, if we want to do trade, we also need to have a look at these territorial disputes, and China needs to make concessions here. Is that something that is doable, you think?
I mean, only on paper. It sounds nice. But I think it's far, far away from reality, from political reality in the region. I mean, first of all, Southeast Asian nations would have to resolve their own border disputes, which they've come a long way to doing, to be fair. But there are still some underlying issues and outstanding issues between, say, Malaysia and the Philippines and some others. So I think in theory it's possible, but I just think it's highly unlikely. And what we've seen is China successfully, sticking to this principle of dealing with each country bilaterally when it comes to these territorial questions. And on that basis, no Southeast Asian country has the diplomatic heft to really negotiate anything meaningful from China. I think, forget the whole of ASEAN, if those maritime claimant states, Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, and maybe even Indonesia as well, could come together and have some joint positions with China, I think that would have a lot of symbolic power that would impact Beijing. Not everything is about military might. And China, while it does want to be a dominant player in Asia, wants to be seen as being respectful, even while it's not respectful. So as Tricia was saying, the same on the economic, if you can call China out and say, here's our coordinated position, can you meet this higher standard? I think it could be effective. But I just think that's so far from the political reality. And what we're finding now, and it's actually the same in Europe, if we're honest, is that when we're under pressure, we actually run from each other to cut our own sweetheart deals with the great powers. We don't really stand together. We fall apart. And that's quite sad. And as an idealist, I can set out all the ways in which we could avoid that. But as a pragmatist, that just seems like what we're bound to do, unfortunately.
But then you still have the European Union that exists as a trade bloc, right? I mean, you have like these 20% tariffs, which are now on pause, were imposed on the European Union as a whole. ASEAN also exists, at least on paper, as a bloc, but you have these individual tariffs that are imposed. Why can't ASEAN be a bloc? What really is the stumbling block there?
Well, I think it's political, right? I mean, ASEAN isn't actually the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's ASEAG. It's an association of governments, and it's an association. It's not a union. And I think the language matters here. Countries in Southeast Asia do not want to pool their sovereignty. They have a very weak secretariat in contrast to how the EU works with its very strict legal and bureaucratic structures, precisely because they don't want to derogate their national sovereign power, hard fought in, murderous, violent wars and anti-colonial conflicts over many decades in much of the region. They don't want to give those powers away to a body that sits in Jakarta or anywhere else. So that is a political problem and a historical problem. It's not a technical problem. You can send in all the bureaucrats you want to say, here's how you design, a customs union. But it's not about that. It's about a political choice. The confusing thing is that ASEAN as an organization and its leadership of Southeast Asia often come out and say, we want to be an economic union. We want all this stuff. But actually, they don't. And they're not willing to put the money in, and they're not willing to pool their sovereignty. And that's totally understandable given their histories, but that's the reality of where we're at, I think. But, I look at it from the outside. Tricia, as an insider, may have a very different view.
I think on this point, I concur. The lack of willingness to give up their sovereignty is essentially at the heart of why ASEAN does not work. So just to give an example and a case study, so there's been all this talk about human rights and wanting to put forward some kind of human rights like consensus within the region. But it's never going to work, right? I mean, look at what's still happening in Myanmar. It's never.
We talked about the failure of the ASEAN plan, right? The 5-point plan. Where did that go? Yeah,
and exactly. And just before I forget, one thought that came up was that I think ideally, and we talk about how ASEAN nations navigate the maritime and territorial disputes, I think ideally what ASEAN would like to do and what individual nations would like to do is to ally with China on one issue, but not on another. So to be able to pick and choose. But that's also really difficult, and that requires very sophisticated diplomacy, which, as Ben also alluded to, may not currently exist. And the leadership as well.
Just quickly on the point of sovereignty, I think I just need to sort of throw that in there. It's I don't think here in Europe countries think that they've given up sovereignty to become a part of the European Union as a trade bloc. I mean, they retain their sovereignty, and that is why these discussions around the European army, for example, are so hard, because that is something that directly trespasses on sovereignty. But as a trade bloc, they feel that there is some unity there. But you wanted to bring in something, Clifford.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting how how little unity there is. You know, I mean, at the end of every ASEAN meeting, they try to come up with a communique, and it's either Myanmar is in the way or China generally often is in the way, and the communique always ends up as being weak and ultimately meaningless. I think the point that people need to act in a multilateral way to deal with this, and that there needs to be a sort of a coalition to deal with this tariff war is extremely important. But the thing is that what's happening instead is that people are making their own deals. They're trying to make their own deals, and you can't blame them because nobody is investing right now. Yeah. That's a major problem. And then if you add that, China is now trying to have a multilateral response basically under its primacy. So it's like trying to get people on its side against the US, but with it leading the charge.
We have some strong opinions in the chat on this topic. Most ASEAN countries, this is from Nilay Chaturvedi again, who's really in on this ASEAN topic today. He's saying most ASEAN countries are too small and weak to matter individually on the international stage. They would never be able to stand up individually to China without cohesion or international support. And then we have another comment here from Netizen Capet, who says ASEAN could be won over by China if it took a 180-degree turn and tried to replace the role of the United States as guarantor of free navigation, offering its own navy as a protector of its neighbours access to the South China Sea.
That is...
So
I would like to see that. I'd like to see that. That's a 180-degree turn from a very, very, very large tanker. Yeah. An immovable tanker, but I'd like to see that.
I have to read it out.
There's a number of things that I'd like to bring in, but I need to ask you guys, Trisha and Ben, can you stay on for another 10 to 12 minutes, or do you guys need to go? I know it's really late for you, Trisha.
I'm okay.
Is that okay? Yeah, sorry, I know that we have just 5 minutes left, but then I'd like to sort of extend it a bit if it's okay with you guys. And I'd like to expand it to bring in that idea that you had earlier raised, Ben, about, and something that Anwar Ibrahim was talking about as well, basically trading with the EU, blocking with the EU as a bloc, but also when Anwar Ibrahim is talking about Japan and Korea, bringing them in as well. And the reason I want to look at Japan and South Korea is because in late March, you had a meeting between China, the representatives of China, Japan and South Korea talking about a free trade agreement for the first time in 5 years. It was interesting because you had two US treaty allies sit down face to face with the US's biggest competitor. Look at what tariffs do. So it was an interesting meeting. I'd like to play a soundbite from the trade relations chief of South Korea, Kim Jong-chul. He had a few remarks about what this meeting was trying to achieve. Let's listen into that first.
The three countries of Japan, China and South Korea have agreed to closely cooperate on issues related to the multilateral trade system, such as WTO reform and the accession of new RCEP members, and to promote a comprehensive and high-level Japan, China, South Korea free trade agreement.
Ben, is that going to happen? A China, Japan, South Korea free trade agreement?
I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, just look at the domestic politics for a start. I mean, South Korea is going to the polls shortly after the impeachment of their former president. Japan has a minority government and no one knows if the prime minister is going to last out the year. And then you layer in the kind of relationships with the US, both in Japan and Korea, and the different character of those. So I think it's hard. But the fact that this is even happening is a sign that even in these two key East Asian US allies, South Korea and Japan, there is real nervousness about their reliance on the US and a need to maybe get some balance. I mean, we've also seen India look to try and resolve, at least in the short term, some of the tensions at its border with China. So everywhere we see China's neighbours, especially those who have disputes and who have been close to the US, trying to kind of reheat their relationships with Beijing as a kind of hedge against the unpredictability of the US. But moving this forward towards kind of concrete reforms is going to be hard because it gets on to the point that Trisha was saying earlier about China needing to reform its own economy, right? If Japan and Korea are going to be expanding access to their economies, they're going to want China to be making pro-market, pro-foreign investor reforms. And in the last 5 to 10 years under Xi Jinping, the Chinese economy has moved in the opposite direction. It's got much harder for foreign investors. And just as a matter of fact, there are more and more Chinese competitors in the Chinese economy who can do the things that Korean, Japanese, even European companies could do exclusively before. So there's more competition and the rules and regulations are getting tougher. So to get that kind of agreement would require quite a reversal of policy from the Chinese leadership, which I suspect is unlikely. But again, the fact that we're even talking about this is really an indicator of how much nervousness there is about reliance on the US at the moment.
Trisha, going back to what Anwar Ibrahim there was saying, talking about strengthening relationships with Japan and South Korea, is this something that could work in ASEAN's favor if ASEAN is able to do it as a grouping with Japan and South Korea as a way to counterbalance whatever trade relationship exists with China?
Yeah, I think this is something, if you remember and recall, Malaysia's former Prime Minister, twice round, Dr. Mahathir, had famously had this Look East policy. In fact, he also had, buy British last policy, nothing against the British here. So Japan and Korea have always been countries that the Southeast Asian, developing or CUP economies were looking at. So it's sort of like a revival of that moment in time. But I just wanted to bring in one thing here, which is related to this conversation around Japan, Korea, and China as well, which is that it's quite interesting that we've gotten this far in the conversation without actually having mentioned semiconductors, because that's something that has come up a lot during the tariff war the last couple of weeks, because semiconductors, and of course we know the big tech decoupling between China and the US. So I'm really interested to see how this whole relationship between China, Japan, Korea, and this so-called FTA will pan out because of the restrictions, right? That not just the US has with regards to like the high-tech semiconductors being restricted to be sold to China, but also what the US has done to ensure that its own allies comply with similar regulations, right? So like the likes of Japan, Korea, even Taiwan, right? And we haven't even talked about Taiwan and where it sits in all of this. But if China is increasingly having this closer proximity to Japan and Korea, could it also be an interesting point of pressure that if Japan and Korea say to China, okay, look, if we're gonna start having these relationships, can we lift our own restrictions? And then you can access these high-value semiconductors that you need in your own supply chain. But that means what's the quid pro quo here? Like, what are you also willing to give us? So again, can we, think about the market, more market-oriented economies, putting pressure on China to do what it needs to do and make a convincing sell for China that this is the time that they can use this moment, bearing in mind that they've also had slowing economic growth over the last couple of years. So I think, these are kind of like intersections where the different countries can use, but that's only if, of course, they're thinking about it the way we do.
Just on semiconductors, it's interesting that you bring it up because Malaysia is one of the countries in Southeast Asia that is making semiconductors. And you're the expert on this, but correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of these semiconductors are being made, some of these semiconductors are coming in unfinished form from China to Malaysia, right? And Malaysia is adding value to it, and it was exporting them to the United States. Is there a revision in this model that might happen given the tariffs that we are talking about?
To be honest, I don't know how exactly it's going to play out. But what I do know is that Malaysia has always been on the lower end of the semiconductor supply chain. But what we've been trying to do in the recent, 1 to 2 years is to go up on the higher end of the value chain. So, for example, getting into the IC design itself as opposed to just the fabrication. And these are possibly the ways that we are trying to strengthen our own supply chains in case things decouple further.
Ben, how receptive is China to actually developing technologies with other partners or other countries in the region?
I think China is somewhat open to it, but I think that the risks are that, the cooperation looks very one way. So when developing countries in the region have looked to bring in China to, say, start to build supply chains around things like electric vehicles or electric vehicle batteries, what you find is a lot of the capital goods, a lot of the kind of industrial machinery comes from China. A lot of the workforce comes from China. And there are real concerns about how much technology transfer there is into the region. But I think it's on a case-by-case basis. There's evidence of that starting to change. And that will come down to what countries are willing and able to negotiate with China. So I think countries are going to have to be asking for a lot more and be much smarter in their negotiations. And again, even in Europe now, we're at that point too, where we're starting to think about we need to be asking the Chinese car companies, the likes of BYD and others, to be transferring their technology to our companies and our systems and our societies because we haven't kept up. But again, it's easy to say that. It's quite hard to do. And China, having acquired a lot of IP through nefarious means as well as fair means, is going to be very reluctant to give away these kind of leading edge technologies that it's been able to develop. I think the other point here is one of China's major advantages is scale, right? It has something like a third of global manufacturing capacity. And that's just not something that can be replicated in Malaysia or Indonesia. So it's not necessarily all about transferring technology. If you can't compete on cost and scale with what China's doing, having the technology doesn't really help you.
Okay, we're going to try and look to the future. This is where I'd like to come to you for some final comments, beginning with you first, Trisha. Here on News Desk, we've talked about tariffs. I think this is like the third or the fourth stream we're doing on tariffs. What can we expect in the coming days when it comes to tariffs concerning Asia particularly?
What can we expect in the coming days? Well, you're not talking about post 90 days, right? So in the next few days, I mean, if we are looking at any type of announcements coming out of the visit of President Xi Jinping to Malaysia and then Cambodia, I don't think that there's anything really, there won't be real concerted effort in addressing tariffs. I think the only thing that you've seen thus far is China giving some exemptions, right? 0% tariffs to some developing countries. Whether it would do the same thing to any of the Southeast Asian nations, I'm really not sure. But I think what you might see would be not direct announcements on the tariffs, but what the potential solutions could be as each of the countries tries to grapple with what are the new export markets available. And I know specifically in Malaysia itself, there's already talk of maybe shifting gears, looking at new markets that have not been looked at before, maybe in Latin America. There was mention of Brazil, and then perhaps in Africa as well. But again, all the nations in Southeast Asia are going to be looking for these new markets at the same time.
Right.
So what can we do to not cut off the nose to spite the face, basically?
Ben, what's going to happen after this 90-day pause on tariffs? Will there be a new set of tariffs which will do the same thing, if not worse? And how will Asia be responding to that?
Look, I think what we can expect is uncertainty, right? And I think that's the problem. If people knew what the tariffs were going to be and knew that they were going to stay in place, companies can work with that. There's other ways to reduce costs. You can reorganize your supply chains. If you want, you can build, T-shirt and shoe factories in Kansas or wherever you want to go in the US. The problem is going to be that there'll just be continuing uncertainty. No one, neither allies nor partners nor adversaries, are going to have any faith in the predictability and consistency of both the messaging and the decisions taken by the Trump administration. So the question will be how countries and companies manage that uncertainty. But just to look a bit further into the distance, I think I've sounded a bit like a geopolitical pessimist, but I think there is an opportunity here, right? For countries, for companies, for citizens to think, how do we want to remake the world? I just don't think we can cling on to the old world, the WTO, the UN. Forget it. These things are crumbling as we speak. We can't think about how to buttress what's collapsing. We've got to think, what can we build that's new, that's smarter, nimbler, quicker, more adaptable, that can help us thrive in this more contested, chaotic world. So I think there really is an opportunity here if people can think outside the box, if people can, and countries and companies can come together. I think it's going to be hard, but I think that's where we have to focus our energies rather than obsessing about Trump's tweets. Because in the end, I think, you know, the chaos we're seeing coming out of the US is kind of a symptom of the world we're in. It's a symptom of frustration with the state of the global economy and global manufacturing and politics and social media in our societies. So I just think even after we have another US president, this is the world we're moving into. So let's start preparing now for the new world rather than just trying to cling on desperately to something that's collapsing around us.
In the interim, I only hope that the iPhone doesn't become more expensive. Small needs I have there. Ben Bland from Chatham House and Trisha Yeo, University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Thank you so much, both of you, for making the time. Trisha, I know it's really late, so thanks so much for staying up and talking to us. Have a good evening, Trisha. Have a good afternoon, Ben. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
Bye, guys. And I wanted to come
I have a really nice positive comment for us that I feel like it's important that after that...
I think we need some positivity.
We do. And it says,
iPhone
really
positivity.
wish the leaders of our world would come together and stop all this military build-up, figure out how to trade fairly and take care of this pale blue dot we all share. And I say yes to that.
They were...
I agree.
Yeah, that pale
Peace
blue
and
dot
love.
from space. Clifford, how do you think that this is going to...
I think it's very interesting. You know, I think what Ben was saying. I mean, I definitely think we need to think about a new kind of future. I think one thing that I think we need to get away from the idea that China is somehow a savior, because you know what's probably going to happen is it'll devalue its currency. The market world will be flooded with cheap Chinese goods in a bid to offset this. It's going to deal with some serious economic challenges. You know, it's just because the US is acting in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that China by default becomes a good actor. So it's, I think that's one thing. And so we need to start thinking in Europe, especially, about how we're going to deal with the new realities of building a system that makes us a bit more fleet of foot, a bit more, makes it faster for us to deal with changing trade environments. I mean, everything else in trade has changed. You know, manufacturing has gotten so fast, consumption has gotten so fast, distribution has gotten so fast, but we still have these quite old trade models, you know, so maybe that's what we're going to see. We're going to see these sort of things accelerating now, and that we become, you know, much better at dealing with crises, because who knows what's going to come after the 90 days are up, or who's going to come post-Trump's fourth term, has been mentioned. So we need to start get away from constant looking at China and looking at the US and start looking at our own situation and thinking about what we're going to do.
More expensive T-shirts. Is that what's going to happen, Jared?
Probably. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, Beres, but you're more concerned about the iPhones.
I'm more concerned about the... but summer's coming, we need some T-shirts as well.
Yeah, maybe. That too.
Simple needs. We have the poll that you've just ended, right, Nehal? And we ended it, as I'm seeing it, with 369 votes.
That's right.
Could we not have waited one more to get 370 to have a nice round figure? But what are the results?
Yeah, so almost 400 people who voted. The question was, how will Trump's tariffs reshape Asia's future? 37% of the people said it will expand China's influence.
There we go.
26% say it will boost intra-Asia trade. 22% say push out US as leading partner. And only 13% of the people said forge new non-Asian alliances.
This is what you were saying, Clifford, right? I mean, generally expanding China's influence. This is what generally the path that we are headed towards, and you were warning us against looking at China as a savior. Any final comments to add?
I think it's always interesting how we just I don't want to say all of us, but there's often this thing of it's like we have to pick a side, or one guy is good and the other guy is bad, and it's, you know, it's sort of like we try to just sort of simplify everything because it's easier that way. But in the world that we're living in, it's just you just can't at all. And I think we kind of have to remember that as well.
Why can't we just be friends?
Why can't we just be friends?
Why can't we just be?
Yeah,
that's what the audience has been saying.
Why can't we just be friends?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll end it on that positive sentiment. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks, Nehal. Thanks, Clifford. Thanks, Jared, for being with us on the stream.
And one more thing, don't forget, of course, that we'll post next week's news topic on the YouTube community channel around 24 hours before we go to air and before we stream.
And
so definitely tune in and leave your comments there.
And we're probably going to be talking about tariff, right? Like what else? Hopefully not. Hopefully there are other things. There are other things happening in the world. We can talk about that.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us on the stream. See you all next time. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bremerhaven's biggest car shipping liner getting ready for the US customs chaos.
So we're preparing for that, with lower sales, lower profits, and fewer jobs to be expected.
Made in Germany. Next on DW. Ideas that make a difference. Visionaries with their projects. Get involved to create a better future today. Experience it. Eco India. In 60 minutes on DW. Hey you! Looking for something amazing? Welcome to DW Spotlight, your portal to all our channels. Watch hand-picked trailers from our shows, docs, and in-depth stories. It's all just a click away. See what's going on. Discover fascinating places. Explore great ideas. Check out our compelling content. Start your journey at DW Spotlight. Dive in and get inspired.
U.S. President Trump spoke of a liberation day when he announced his tariff package, only to plunge the global economy into turmoil. Perhaps that's why he suspended most of the tariffs for 90 days. But not those targeting China. China hit back and threatened to halt exports of critical raw materials like rare earths. The dispute is now a trade war. Uncertainty is spreading, reaching even the export terminal in Bremerhaven. Also on Made this week, the EU, a pivot to Asia in international trade, sustainable building materials in India and Germany, and Medellin, textiles and tourists instead of drugs.
These cars are still rolling towards the U.S. At BLG Logistics, a port in Bremerhaven, a major German shipping hub, Mercedes, VWs, and BMWs are loaded onto the Platinum Ray Glovis, a cargo ship headed for Brunswick in the U.S. state of Georgia. 84% of the cars waiting here for export are from German manufacturers. According to industry group VDA, another 450,000 German-made vehicles were exported there last year. Supervisor Lisa Seegelken wants to stay optimistic for now.
Of course, all our employees are worried. But we've already lived through a few crises. So we're all still assuming that nothing major will change for us.
However, BLG Logistics could be severely affected by these new U.S. car tariffs of 25%. 1.5 million vehicles make their way abroad through Bremerhaven annually. A third are destined for the U.S. The head of the logistics company is therefore not so optimistic.
We estimate the number of cars will drop by half. So we're preparing for that, with lower sales, lower profits, and fewer jobs to be expected.
And it could get even worse.
The Trump administration has announced yet another weapon, and it's already in the works. The idea is to impose penalties on every ship call by a Chinese shipping company or any ship built in China, even if it's not operated by one. These penalties would be $1.5 million per ship call. That would be the next blow, cutting into trade routes like a chainsaw.
To avoid these penalties, they could only use U.S. ships in Bremerhaven. However, there are too few of them available to meet the demand. Those in the import business could be affected too. Jörg Beule, for example, imports vehicles, like this former police car, from the US to Germany. He converts them to European standards for his customers. His company, Auto Kalkofen, also repairs American models with spare parts from the US. Many of these goods come from countries like Mexico and Canada, but now face higher U.S. tariffs. That drives up costs for companies buying from the U.S. and eventually for consumers too. The same applies to other products, such as retro signs, which Jörg Beule also sells. If the EU imposes counter tariffs on U.S. imports, it could become more expensive for him.
If they say, I'll add 20% now because Trump wants 20, and we'll add another 20, then it gets really expensive.
In the port, you can already feel that there could be counter tariffs.
We know of an American motorcycle manufacturer that, anticipating European tariffs, has already chartered 25 cargo planes to ship its motorcycles to Europe early.
At the port, they're considering expanding trade with other regions and sectors, like renewable energy, to reduce dependence on the U.S. and on car imports and exports.
One way for the EU to escape the tariff dilemma is to shift trade away from its transatlantic partner, the US, and toward Asian markets. To India, for example, a rising economic power. And China could also become an increasingly important trading partner. In fact, many European companies are already ramping up investments in both India and China. We took a closer look at a few examples.
Reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal. That means they do it to us and we do it to them.
Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. It seems U.S. President Donald Trump knows no other word these days, and it's a threat that's also affecting European industry. How hard will they hit Europeans? And if relations with the U.S. are so difficult, why not expand trade with Asia even more? Hannover Messe, one of the world's largest trade fairs, is the place to feel the pulse of German industry. Major players and mid-sized firms are engaging with the global market. A passionate debate is underway over punitive U.S. tariffs. Of course, this worries us as it's a termination of a rules-based world and of a global economic order. It's worrying because we've successfully globalized over the last 30 years, precisely on the basis of self-given rules, which are now being questioned and breached from all sides, which will cause epochal changes. This is worrying right now. Should companies focus more on regions like Asia? And can they? Many already do. That's clear at the trade fair. China and the U.S. are still Europe's top import partners. At 21%, the U.S. remains Europe's leading export market, followed by the U.K., with China third at just 8%. Sounds promising? Not quite. Germany, once the world's top export nation, is now pursuing a different path, producing directly in Asia instead of exporting. Many industries have done this for years, especially since the COVID crisis.
in order to reduce our CO2 emissions, if you think about the logistics of our product. We have a strategy local for local, and we develop our products locally also now in India. We produce them more and more in India, and of course then we sell them in India.
Why? One example from rural Germany. EBM Papst, a southern German fan manufacturer, has been in China since 1996 and recently opened a new headquarters there.
We want to be close to our customers, as we want to reduce transportation costs and provide good customer support. So we are usually where our customers are, which today is primarily China, India, Singapore, and Malaysia. As a rule, we started with a sales office in these countries, then we also relocated final assembly there relatively quickly. And now we have a localization level in China of over 80%. That is, over 80% is produced in China for China.
China has become indispensable for European companies.
China has long since become not only the world's factory, but increasingly also an important location for research and development. Important innovations come from China, and the trend in China for China is very present, as are the important technological developments.
China has long been the EU's top Asian trading partner, but that could soon change. India is catching up. Why?